Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into something that, well, it might just change how you look at Tai Chi Chuan practice.
Mm-hmm.
For a moment, let's maybe set aside the slow, gentle flow we often see, and hear about.
Right.
Instead, we'll get into the history and the practice of its two-person training drills.
Yeah, the partner work.
Exactly. And our source material, it's a really fascinating stack of articles, research, discussions about Tai Chi combat training, specific forms that suggest there's, well, a lot more to it than just push hands.
Absolutely.
Mm.
The documents, they really paint a picture that's perhaps less familiar than, the one you might bump into in many modern classes or parks.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull out the most important nuggets from these sources. We want to help you understand how these partner practices actually evolved, what they were originally designed for, and maybe crucially, what that means for how we interpret the movements themselves. So get ready for some surprising facts maybe, and hopefully a few genuine aha moments about what's really encoded in those forms.
Okay, so where to start? What immediately stands out looking at the historical context in these sources is the language itself.
Mm-hmm.
The core finding seems to be that the historical term for two-person drills in Tai Chi Chuan isn't actually Tui Shou.
Wait, hang on. So not push hands. What was it then?
It was Da Shou.
Da Shou.
Yeah, and the characters, they literally translate to striking hands or hitting hands.
Striking hands. Wow. Okay, that feels like a completely different intention, doesn't it, compared to pushing hands?
It absolutely does. And the sources, they really underscore this. They point out that the classic text we often call the Song of Pushing Hands is actually titled The Song of Striking Hands, Da Shogen.
No way. So even the classic song.
Exactly. It suggests that even way back in those foundational texts, the emphasis was, well, maybe more on hitting, or at least included hitting, not just pushing.
Huh. But that word dag, it's pretty versatile in Chinese, isn't it? Like, I know it can mean striking, but doesn't it also mean things like playing or doing or hitting a ball?
That's a really good question.
How do we know the sources aren't just using it in a general doing hands together kind of sense?
Right, and the sources do address that.
Mm-hmm.
While Da is definitely versatile, the specific martial context, the way the characters are used, it points pretty clearly towards striking or, fighting application. They even note this subtle but kind of important distinction. The exact same characters a day can, if you use a different tone, mean like thug or hired muscle.
Oh, okay.
But the historical context and the tonal use within martial arts circles, it clearly differentiates striking hands as a specific training method from that other, negative meaning. It just highlights how careful you need to be when interpreting these old terms.
Okay, that makes sense. So if Da Shou, striking hands, is the order term, what did that training actually look like? How did they practice striking hands with a partner? Must have been risky.
Well, the materials described Da Shou training as typically involving using arm techniques naturally and also stepping footwork together with a partner.
Right.
The key distinction from, say, full free fighting, Sanshou, was that it was more of a structured way to practice striking application, but in a controlled setting.
Ah, controlled.
Yeah, it was seen as practical for building combat skills, but with, less risk than just going all out in unrestrained free fighting.
Okay, so it was a step towards real fighting, but maybe not the whole 9 yards. And how does that contrast with Tui Shou then? The pushing hands we mostly hear about today.
Well, Tui Shou, as it's described in these sources, it sort of evolved more into a type of, well, they call it contract hands.
Contract hand.
Yeah, like the practitioners agree on specific rules beforehand. And the main rule became only using pushing techniques. No hitting, no grabbing usually.
Oh, right. Stick to the pushing.
Exactly. And it definitely became the standard way to test skills between practitioners, which we'll touch on. But the sources do suggest that this heavy emphasis on only pushing has, maybe in some cases, been taken to a bit of an extreme.
How so?
Well, potentially losing sight of the original intention, which was probably broader, more about preparing for actual combat, where, let's face it, striking is definitely on the table.
Yeah, I see. Because if you only train pushing, you're kind of missing a huge piece of a real fight scenario. Makes sense. But I remember the sources mentioning a risk with Da Shou practice, too, didn't they? If it's striking hands, doesn't that risk getting out of control easily?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They really highlight that danger. Doing Da Shou with someone you don't know well, or maybe someone less disciplined,
Yeah.
it could quickly just evolve into a plain old street fight, Da Shua.
Just a scrap.
Exactly. So it really requires trust, control and a mutual understanding between the partners for it to be effective training rather than just, well, a brawl.
Okay, so Aries striking hands, that's one specific kind of drill. But didn't the sources suggest there's an even broader term, maybe even older? Something that covers a whole range of partner stuff, not just the hitting.
That's right, yeah. There's another term, sounds similar but uses different characters, Shou.
Okay, another dashu.
Yeah, this one translates more like joining hands or bridging hands.
Joining hands, bridging.
And the sources indicate this is probably a broader, older term. Potentially goes way back, maybe even to the 1200s. And it essentially just means practice or training to fight using partner contact. It's more like an umbrella term.
Gotcha. So, dasho, joining, is the big picture, any kind of training contact. And dasho, striking, is one specific type under that umbrella. What other kinds of practices fall under this older A category according to the sources? Any examples?
Yeah, they list several really fascinating examples. It shows just how broad this partner work was, well beyond just pushing or pure striking.
Yeah.
They include things like Shou, which is rubbing hands, dasho, hitting striking hands, obviously, Shou, coiling hands, mushu, grinding hands, and even one called Jishu, possibly lifting hands. Though the details on that last one seem a bit sparse in these particular sources.
Wow, okay. Rubbing, coiling, grinding. That's a really interesting mix, not just hitting and pushing at all. Can you give us a bit more insight? Like, what did some of those feel like, or what were they trying to achieve?
Sure. Well, the deepest dives in these particular sources are definitely on Du striking and later Tushu pushing. But they do offer glimpses into the others. Rushu, rubbing hands, gets mentioned in the context of arts like feet and crane boxing. It suggests maybe a focus on close range manipulation, sensitivity, maybe entanglement.
Okay.
Panshu, coiling hands, that one's strongly linked with Shingi practice. And the name itself, coiling, kind of gives you a sense of developing specific body mechanics like drilling actions, twisting, wringing power through that partner contact.
Right, that Jingji feel.
Exactly. And then there's Moshu, grinding hands. This one's particularly linked to Bagua, and honestly, it sounds pretty brutal.
Grinding. How so?
It's described literally as a method to grind the strength out of both practitioners. It wasn't about being gentle or compliant. It required intense, genuine whole body strength, really working hard against a partner of equal skill. The goal was to build raw, functional power under serious pressure.
Wow.
It really underscores how diverse and sometimes, frankly, how intense these older training methods could be.
Yeah, grinding hands definitely sounds intense. Okay, so with this whole spectrum of partner practices, striking, rubbing, coiling, grinding, all aimed at training combat, why? Why did Tui Shou pushing hands become the standard way to compare skills later on? You know, in the mid to late 1800s, with big names like Dong Haishuan, Yang Luchen, Go Yunshin involved.
That's a really important question the sources tackle. How do you compare skill levels between practitioners from different but related internal styles, Taiji, Shingi, Bagua, without it just turning into a full-on, potentially dangerous fight every time?
Right, you need some common ground.
Exactly. And Tui Shou seems to have offered a pragmatic solution there. It focused specifically on principles that were common to all three styles. Things like Zan, Nian, Lian, Sui, adhering, connecting, sticking, following.
The sticky hands concepts.
Precisely. So by creating this controlled environment where only those connection principles were tested, primarily through pushing, it provided a safer, standardized way to compare sophisticated martial skill. You could see who had better structure, sensitivity, root, without necessarily measuring who could land the hardest blow.
Okay, so it's almost like a diplomatic innovation, a way to have a martial contest that wasn't just a knockout competition. That actually makes a lot of sense from a practical, historical viewpoint.
Exactly. It served a very specific purpose, particularly for that inter-style comparison and for really drilling down on those fundamental connection skills.
Okay, building on that idea of practical fighting, let's zoom back into Ohei, the striking hands aspect. The sources really seem to emphasize using the forearms in Chinese martial arts. Why the big focus on forearms specifically?
Well, the forearm is just a really versatile and robust tool. Think about it, it covers a large area.
Yeah.
Which makes it effective for both offense, like striking, and defense, like blocking or intercepting attacks. Plus, it's naturally somewhat conditioned just through everyday use, but for real martial application, it definitely requires specific conditioning.
And that conditioning, that often comes from practices like standing, right? Zanzhuang.
Precisely. Just like you might condition your fists or shins, You need to condition your forearms to handle both absorbing impact and delivering it effectively. The sources kind of imply that this partner work, Shou, assumes both people have done their foundational work, including that conditioning.
So the contact isn't just painful, it actually helps build resilience.
Ideally, yes. It becomes part of the hardening process itself, done correctly.
Got it. There's that great combat saying mentioned in the sources: the opponent attacks, but I arrive first. How does that connect specifically to using forearms in practice in Shou?
Ah, yeah, that saying. It perfectly describes a core forearm application in Dale. It means, basically, instead of waiting for your opponent's punch or strike to get close to you and then you try to block it defensively,
Mm-hmm.
you use your forearm offensively to strike their attacking arm before it reaches its target on your body. You're proactively intercepting and disrupting their attack right at the source on their limb.
Intercepting their weapon, essentially. What kind of effect could that forearm strike actually have? I mean, are we talking about just stopping it, or?
Well, with proper practice, the right mechanics, and cultivated power, internal power, the sources suggest this kind of intercepting forearm strike could potentially cause what they call O-Dad-Wan. Yeah, which can mean breaking, like literally breaking the bone, or at the very least, inflicting enough significant pain and structural disruption to completely halt their attack and give you the decisive initiative. It's a pretty brutal, direct way to neutralize an incoming threat.
Wow. Okay, so in training, then, when you're doing us striking hands inside the school with a partner you know and trust, how do you practice that kind of technique without, well, actually breaking your partner's arm every time?
Right, and that's where the inside the school part is absolutely key. With a known, trusted partner, you can practice the techniques at speed with intent, but you learn to slightly pull or absorb the power right at the point of forearm on forearm contact.
Okay, so you check the power at contact.
Exactly. However, and this is important, the intent behind the movement is still full power, and the aim for any follow-up finishing strikes, maybe towards vital areas, that is trained with full force projection, assuming they weren't stopped or disabled by that initial forearm contact.
Nice.
So while causing an actual break isn't the goal in training, obviously the practice develops the ability to deliver that level of disruptive force, that breaking energy, and then immediately follow up with fight-ending techniques aimed at vital points.
So you're practicing the full sequence, the full intent, the whole chain of techniques, just modulating the impact on those specific contact points to keep your partner safe.
Precisely. And the sources really emphasize this isn't just like choreography or light tapping. They stress that even though it might feel like playing at fighting, they use the word wanmun compared to a real life or death brawl.
Yeah.
It is serious training meant to prepare you for playing with your life, a wanmun, in a true self-defense situation. Every practice session, every drill, is meant to be approached with that level of seriousness and intent.
That connection is really powerful. It definitely makes you look at the forms differently, doesn't it? Thinking about how these kinds of direct, hard techniques might be hidden within those flowing movements.
Exactly.
So let's look at a concrete example of this. How are striking applications specifically encoded within the forms? Your sources use the Yang style, right? They talked about the 5 hammers.
Yes, exactly. These sources point to specific striking sequences, right there in the traditional Yang style long form, that they see as clear examples of this older, more combative intent. They identify 5 distinct hammers, which are essentially powerful punch sequences.
Okay, what are the names of these 5 hammers? Can you list them?
Sure. According to texts they reference, like Fu Zongwen's work, they are: number 1, step, parry, deflect, and hammer. Number 2, twist, body hammer. Number 3, unload, parry, deflect, and hammer. Number 4 is punch down hammer. And number 5 is punch crotch hammer.
Quite descriptive names. And these appear multiple times in the long form.
Yeah, they occur about 14 times in total throughout the Yang long form, woven into the choreography.
Wow.
But the sources particularly highlight what they call a core sequence that shows up 3 times. It's the number 2, twist, body hammer, immediately followed by number 3, the unload, parry, deflect, and hammer.
Okay, that specific combo.
Yeah, and its placement in the form, often appearing after sequences like flash hands or punch down, suggests it's meant to be a critical, aggressive, offensive combination.
So what makes this core sequence stand out so much? What's particularly pugilistic about it, according to the sources?
Well, they describe its characteristics pretty vividly. It's a rapid series of offensive punches, yes, but also includes palm strikes. It involves a powerful rotation of the whole body,
Okay.
driving these consecutive rolling punches and palm strikes. It uses the whole body for power, obviously, But notably, the waist action is described as being used for fijin, that explosive, expansive force Tai Chi is famous for.
Right.
But here, it's described as having a kind of concealed retraction quality, like a slight pulling back just before the explosion. And one source author explicitly said it felt much closer to direct boxing application than some other types of fijin you might see in Tai Chi.
Interesting. Closer to boxing. And the targets, I assume they weren't just random arm waves.
Not at all. The application targets described for this core sequence are very specific vital areas. The first hammer, the twist body hammer, is typically aimed towards the face.
Face, okay.
The subsequent palm strike, part of the unload sequence, targets the chest area. And the third hammer, the final part of that sequence, is directed towards the lower ribs, often specifying a particular vital point in that region, sometimes even referenced by its acupuncture name, like SP21, spleen 21.
Face, chest, lower ribs.
Yeah, that's very direct, very combative. No ambiguity there.
Not really, no. And the source author who focused on this really felt this sequence was just a clear, undeniable example of what they called the lost pugilistic portion of Yang Taiji Quan. They argued it clearly shows those boxing roots. And crucially, they noted that specific Shou striking hands two-man drills were taught right alongside this sequence in the form, specifically to train its application.
Ah, so the drill was tied directly to that part of the form.
Yeah.
Exactly. Distinguishing it from other, maybe more general drills, like, say, the choreographed 88 Sanchu set or the standard 4 square 2 Shou practice.
Yeah.
This was about making this specific sequence work.
Right, so the form itself isn't the complete training method. The form is more like a library or a map, maybe. And these specific partner drills are the key to actually unlocking the combat application stored within it.
That's a great way to put it. That connection between the form movement and its specific two-person application drill seems to be what truly reveals the function.
Yeah.
And it's also why the sources kind of lament that many modern shorter Yang forms, or maybe some of the Wushu modified competition forms, unfortunately often omit this specific critical hammering sequence entirely.
Wow. So they're potentially missing a key piece of the original combative puzzle. That's significant. Was there an open hand version of these hammers mentioned at all?
Yes, briefly. The sources mention an open hand variant, sometimes given the evocative name White Snake Spit's Tongue.
White snake spits tongue.
Yeah. It's described as using a vertical arm structure, employing pung jin, that outward expansive energy combined with a sharp finger flick or maybe a thrust, often targeting the opponent's eyes.
Eyes. Okay. Again, very direct, very no-nonsense technique.
Absolutely. Straightforward and functional.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how digging into these historical texts and training descriptions paints such a vivid picture. It's a practical, sometimes pretty brutal picture of the art's roots.
It really does ground what can sometimes seem like abstract or purely health-focused movements in very concrete functional application.
So let's bring it all together. What does all of this mean for you, the listener, whether you practice Tai Chi, maybe other martial arts, or you're just, endlessly curious about these kinds of topics?
Well, I think understanding this historical context, especially the distinction between Shou striking hands and Tui Shou pushing hands, and then seeing these specific direct striking applications like the Yang 5 hammers literally encoded in the forms, it should fundamentally change how we perceive Tai Chi Quan, or at least offer a different lens.
Yeah, it definitely highlights that beneath the surface, maybe beneath that slow, graceful movement we commonly associate with it, lies a system that was, at its core, meticulously designed for effective combat.
Right. And it also shows how the evolution of training methods, from that broader joining hands, which seemed to encompass striking, grappling, maybe more, down to the more focused pushing hands, used for specific skill comparison, it reflects changing priorities over time. And perhaps, as some of the sources suggest, maybe a potential dilution of some of that original combative focus in certain lineages or contexts.
So ultimately, this deep dive really underscores the idea, doesn't it? That developing genuine martial capability in an art like Tai Chi, if that's actually your goal, it seems to require dedicated partner training that specifically explores and refines these practical applications. It has to go beyond just solo forms or purely recreational, rules-based pushing.
It really reveals that there are these deep layers of practical meaning encoded even within very familiar forms, just waiting there to be unlocked through the right kind of partner exploration and study.
So we've taken quite a journey today. We've dived deep into the history and practice of two-person drills in Tai Chi Quan, uncovered the foundational concept of Shou, striking hands, contrasted it with the more modern Shou, pushing hands, explored that broader spectrum of older partner work under Shou, joining hands, and even pinpointed specific hard-hitting techniques like the Yang style's 5 hammers encoded right within the forms themselves.
Yeah, it's been quite the exploration.
This journey through the sources has really revealed the dynamic history and the very practical, sometimes surprisingly direct, combat intent embedded deep within these arts.
It's definitely a rich field for continued study and practice for anyone interested.
And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe something for you to think about. Considering how these partner practices shifted over time, moving from explicitly emphasizing striking a dasho way and covering a whole range of combative drills under eat towards the standardization and heavy emphasis on primarily pushing Shou, it really raises an important question, doesn't it? Especially for anyone serious about developing real martial skill today.
What's the question?
How might reconnecting with, or perhaps rediscovering, these older, more direct striking and resistance-based partner drills impact the development of genuine, practical martial ability now, compared to maybe focusing solely on solo forms or the more common competitive sport aspect of push hands? Something for you to definitely ponder as you continue your own learning journey and your exploration of these fascinating, complex traditions.